we will ever be. Hello and welcome, everybody. And thank you for coming to join our session on unlocking radical collaboration to deliver on nature positive and net zero goals. My name is Niyitegeka, and I'm a research director responsible for sustainable finance at the Cambridge University's Institute for Sustainability Leadership. We're delivering this event together with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and as such, I'll co-chair it with Dominic Waughray. So effectively, CISL is a department within the University of Cambridge, but we're a slightly funky one. We do education and research, and it's quite lovely to have some of our alumni in the room as well. But we also run what we call leadership groups. And within the Center for Sustainable Finance, we have 3 of those: the Banking Environment Initiative, the Investment Leaders Group, and ClimateWise, which is our platform for insurance companies. Effectively, we know that climate and nature are interlinked, and climate warming has adverse effects on the loss of ecosystem services, while at the same time, nature loss drives increasing climate change. So we know that loss of forest and marine ecosystems contribute 4.8 billion tons of carbon and 1 billion tons of carbon per year into the atmosphere. So we will be talking today about how do we drive collaboration to solve nature positive and net zero goals. The event will be structured along 3 main parts. Firstly, we'll have an intervention from Hyacinthe Niyitegeka, who's a water scientist and climate advocate, who'll be talking to us about loss and damage. Then Dominic and I will have a little bit of a fireside chat talking around, why climate and nature should be addressed together, what we're currently seeing at COP27 and what our priorities for next year are. And then we'll have 2 panels, one on implementation and one on radical collaboration. And during those panels, I'd be also looking forward for the rest of the audience to come in with their questions. But without further ado, can I please ask Hyacinthe to take us away and talk to us about youth and loss and damage, please.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, perfect. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here to share the perspective of youth on loss and damage. Loss and damage is a reality around the world, but those from developing countries are being affected the most. I think for those who have been following discussions and reading different articles on the issue, you must you're understanding how the issue is. Recently, we have been witnessing many extreme weather events, ranging from Pakistan, which affected millions and millions of people. We also had some from developing countries and others. The effects of the loss and damage range from, we have both economic and non-economic loss and damage. We are different people from those on the front lines of climate change are being affected in many ways, including losing their cultural activities. They are losing their lives. They are losing their homes and many other things. The most worrying thing and the most thing we are scared of is to see how they are not seeing their future to be really positive. When it comes to young people like me in her 20s and alongside other youth from around the world, we learn this from our elders and parents. They always tell us how this never happened before. When you ask how they survived, like they say the flooding or the drought, they always say it never happened before. And science makes it very clear that adaptation and mitigation failed, and now we are remaining with losses and damages from the climate crisis. So as young people, we are really worried to inherit this warm planet. We are here as negotiators like me. We also have activists who are pushing outside the negotiation rooms to see whether world leaders and other people who are decision makers can make a change. We are not asking a lot. We only want the world leaders to recognize the reality of loss and damage, to know how our people are being affected, and to know how we are really worried to inherit this hot planet. I know different parents love their children, and we are worried that when we become parents, how are we going to leave our kids at this planet? And what we want to see is they take action now. I'm representing millions of people here, and younger people here, and I'm raising their voice, and I'm hopeful that at the end of this call we'll have something tangible, especially regarding addressing loss and damage. So to address loss and damage, we need technical assistance, we need technology to implement the project to recover from loss and damage impacts. We need finance to address it. We also need capacity building. On part of the capacity building, of course we are here, but we are still very few. I wish, and our wish is to have many youth people from around the world, especially those on frontiers of climate change, like from the Pacific and the other island states, and other countries that are really being vulnerable to climate change impacts. So like capacity building, of course we will be able to contribute to that, but there is a need of more engagement from developed countries and the other world leaders. We also need technical assistance technology, which we are pushing for through Santiago Niyitegeka for loss and damage negotiations. That's something I'm so glad that there's a progress to see the negotiators agreeing on how they will deliver on the technical assistance, but still a gap to see how that will be done, especially when it comes to funding arrangement to make sure that Santiago network is operational. Another point is on loss and damage finance. We are not seeing progress on that matter, where we would like to see establishment of loss and damage finance facility, which will help in gathering and correcting loss and damage finance, which will be used to address loss and damage. And the main need from developing countries or other states that are vulnerable to climate impacts, that are being most affected, is to see loss and damage finance facility established here at COP27, and then we discuss on the modalities and the process, how everything will work after in the coming 2 years. So I won't speak a lot. Those were the main points I wanted to highlight. Just to say in a few words, to say that as youth, we are really worried for tomorrow, for future, because we are seeing what's happening. We are seeing loss and damage, and we have heard a lot from the science that it's really, that adaptation failed. So we are really worried. We would like to share our worry with everyone around the world. Another thing is that it's possible to act to address loss and damage. So we are calling on world leaders. We are calling on everyone in the room and outside there, because our people, some of them, they don't even know what's happening to them. I always give an example. Recently, I visited one of the areas in my country who have been smallholder farmers who have been affected by flooding, and their crops were and severe erosion, and their crops were washed away. And most of them, they depend 100% on agriculture, because most in our country, 80%, more than 80% depend on agriculture. I was asking them whether they know the climate change, what's happening, because you always hear that this never happened before. I wanted to make sure that at least they understand what's happening. So they said, some of them say, they know a little bit about climate change, for those who listen to news or watch TVs, but others don't even know what's going on. That's how it comes to mental health. They are really affected, because something comes and they are not ready to accept that. It's an issue. So we are here to raise the voices of those people who don't even understand, to keep putting more effort to make sure they understand what's happening to them, so they can be ready of what's going to come their way, but I still, yeah, I think that, yeah, I would like, we are voices of those who are the voiceless people, and yeah, it can help us all to, yeah, to address loss and damage, and it's possible. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Hyacinthe. Thank you for bringing the voice of the vulnerable community as well as the voice of the youth and asking us these questions. So Dominic, you and I get to have a fun conversation now.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. I feel like I'm going to be kind of asked questions. I remember doing my undergrad at my alma mater and getting loads of tricky questions on sustainability, so don't catch me out. But to get the ball rolling, it was so important to hear those opening remarks for Hyacinthe, because you just nailed it, if you don't mind me saying, because we have to look at this in a holistic way, and we have these different tracks of very technical terms and people arguing about his mitigation and adaptation and loss and damage, but the point is we need that kind of development possibility for everyone on fair and equal terms, given the challenges that we're going to face now and over the next 2 decades. So kind of let's make that happen. And sometimes it gets so complicated and twisted up in different dynamics that it's heartbreaking sometimes. So I think if we can work on that through this topic of unlocking radical collaboration, then we're in good shape. And I understand, Nina, to that end, that CISL has identified 5 kind of key reasons or levers that can help address that climate-nature axis together. So perhaps you could tell us about those.
Yeah, so we've been working with investment managers and banks and asset owners and trying to actually talk to them about how do we not push climate and nature into a sequential solution, but rather address them together. And there are 5 reasons why that should be done. One is we know that nature risks have materiality well above climate risk. So if you think about our ability to source pharmaceuticals, to source antibiotics from our environment, we also know that there are unintended consequences when we look at nature and climate in separation. So obviously COP27 has been talking a lot about things like carbon capture and storage. But if you bring nature into the conversation, you know that bioenergy with carbon capture and storage and the amount of BECCS that is currently written into scenarios is not really viable from a nature perspective. So unless you address these together, you're potentially creating problems for yourself down the line. We also know that there are compounding effects across these too. So for example, with HSBC, we did a piece of work on looking at water stress in heavy industry. And obviously, water curtailment risk is driven by climate change. And we saw that the credit ratings of an entire heavy industry portfolio go down by at least 1 notch, and for many companies within that portfolio by multiple notches, going from investment grade into speculative. But also there are positive things, there are synergies and there are cost efficiencies. So if we think about coastal protection, the cost of green infrastructure, thinking about mangroves, could be up to 5 times cheaper than building up grey infrastructure, building up coastal infrastructure. And finally, there are risks to the stability of the financial sector as a whole if we address these two in separation. And actually, if we're thinking about the financial sector as well as the corporate sector, what also comes to mind, and maybe also brought on with Hyacinthe was coming, is thinking about accountability and holding actors accountable for what they're doing. And actually, come back to you, Dominic, right now. So I know you've been campaigning for looking at how to strengthen carbon accounting and accountability in the system. So maybe you can talk to us about that a little bit.
Thank you, Nina. Nice segue. Yeah, the thing is, I think we probably all come at this from very quite siloed backgrounds, and whether we mean to or not, it just happens. So in terms of the carbon accountability circuitry, we know that if you're a corporate or someone from the financial community, you're under quite a lot of intense pressure now, and rightly so, to set what's called a science-based target or some kind of other sector plan. And we know there's a whole community based around that who've got different ideas or thoughts attached to it. But once you've done that, you actually need what they call a transition plan. You need to put your investment in place. You need to show where your CapEx is going, your R&D, where your human development requirements are. And you need to kind of present that to investors in the world. So a lot of people set a science-based target, and increasingly in the shorter run, but many fewer have actually done that transition plan. But once you've done that transition plan, you've then got to nail what they call a carbon accounting, and that's things like the greenhouse gas protocol. And for those of you who are really into it, you'll know that the scope 3 element of carbon accounting is a big part of the inventory, but a tricky bit to figure out. And then once you've done your carbon accounting, you've got to disclose it somewhere. And we have CDP, and we have many other activities underway, the International Sustainability Standards Board. And all of these have different people who are kind of wandering around the COP, doing different sessions like us, all in their kind of bits of the system. And that system itself doesn't really jive. I don't know how many people are here from an industry perspective. Who's from a company or an industry perspective in the room? Okay. Thank you very much for being here, but you know when you try to go through all of those stages to get your climate accountability in place, it's quite hard and there's lots of different people. The transaction costs are quite big. So hold that thought, and then we have brilliant people like Harvey over here. Harvey, stick your hand up. So Harvey Locke, if you don't know him, is an absolute kind of rock star. He's been campaigning to not only think about kind of climate, but think about nature and make that accountability system work from a whole nother dimension. Because we have conservation people, and we have climate people, and we have people who've been working on nature-based solutions and natural capital accounting, and people working on climate accounting. And goodness knows, if you listen to what Hyacinthe said, we haven't got the time. We haven't got the time, but we certainly have the capacity as human beings to join up this system. And I think that is our task, if we go back to the title of this session, which says Radical Collaboration, and that is certainly what we're putting forward at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Such a business lens to get that money into the places where it needs to go, but make the whole thing easier and with much less transaction cost to work through all of those pieces that I just talked about. And that's a journey that will be going on for the next 12 months at least. But I touched there deliberately so, given the challenge that we've been set on the net zero journey, then linked it to nature. But of course, many of you, and I suppose you too, Nina, and the team, will be moving, and Harvey, will be moving from here in Sharm el-Sheikh to the slightly less warm climes of Montreal for something called COP15. So some people might be a bit confused about that, but what is COP15, and what do you hope that we can all expect from that, Nina?
Well, that's quite a tall order for me to explain what COP15 is. But effectively, I think, when we're thinking about what we are talking about here, it's really encouraging to actually see nature come into the conversation in a much more structural way. I think we've seen it in Glasgow and we're seeing it here. And just this morning, we had a really interesting roundtable on COP to COP. So how do we go from the climate conversations at COP27 to discussing a global biodiversity framework at COP15 in Montreal? And effectively what we're looking for there is to set up this policy framework, this kind of, that will enable businesses and financial institutions to actually start in a much more structural way, thinking both about nature-related financial risks, but also how to invest in nature. We're calling for mandatory disclosures. We're looking, the whole idea is that we reconfigure our economic and financial systems to start allowing nature to recover by 2030. And that doesn't leave us with a lot of time. We've got about 8 years to completely change the way we do business and finance. So I guess from that perspective, what are your priorities in the coming 12 months?
So, we go from here in Sharm el-Sheikh on the climate track to the United Arab Emirates about this time next year. I think they just released the dates, 30th of November to the 12th of December or thereabouts. So we have a kind of a year's progress via obviously the Indian G20 and the Japanese G7 to really kind of focus on this accountability issue that I said, because at the foundation of making a much smoother flywheel for businesses to show they are doing what they said they would do in Glasgow, you need that accountability framework in place. And that will attract a lower cost of capital, hopefully, to those who are doing it right. And that will set us on to that pathway for net zero. And then looking at that in the context of key sectors, we're delighted to have an arrangement with the United Arab Emirates presidency to look at some particular industrial tracks of work, as well as this accountability piece. There's also a very large area which hits quite clearly on the nature positive and net zero goals, and that's the food and agriculture system, which is a huge and complicated area, as many of you know, but that is something that the UAE are keen to bring in to the picture for next year. So I think what we'll see is a focus on some, let's say, kind of industrial sectors which really do need to make that shift if you think about where the location of the UAE COP is. And so that'll be a very important. Now, in that context, coming out of CBD COP15, and maybe this global biodiversity framework, which might be the kind of arrangement, is a little bit of where the money comes from to make that happen. So one of the interesting areas that's been taking place here, I mean, in negotiation terms, it's this kind of weird Article 6, but outside of that, it's this issue of natural climate solutions, the flow of finance from companies to invest in nature-based solutions, and all the guardrails that should be put in place to just catch that last bit of abatement each year once you've done everything else. So I think that is a super interesting area that bridges the net zero and the nature, because frankly speaking, for those of you who are closer to the COP15 nature agenda, where is that money going to come from to meet all that investment in nature? Because I know it's a very big amount of money. So this is, we could actually carry on quite a lot like this, but I think we have to bring in the rest of our esteemed panelists. So if you're all right, Nina, I might turn this way and then come back to you in a few minutes. Okay. Okay. So we're going to have a little bit of a kind of conversation on this side of the long table around some of those issues which have kind of filtered through already. You can see Nina and I were sort of exploring that climate to nature, the processes and the topic areas. But first of all, I'd very much like to turn to Renata Scofield, who's the Global Senior Director of Environmental Stewardship at GHK. Now, this has already come up, but you all know that GSK is one of the leading sort of health pharma companies that there is. So we've already done a kind of climate and nature piece, but really, Renata, there's a kind of intertwined climate-nature crisis which is actually fundamental to long-term human health. So this adds another layer into this, which you're dealing with in all your innovation and complexity at GSK. So perhaps you could share with us how you're leaning in on that climate, nature, health axis and figuring out how to contribute positively in that regard, because I think we thought it was complicated, but boy, you've got a complex job on your hands to bring that other dimension in as well. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Dominic, and thanks for having me here. So you're absolutely right. Climate and nature loss is the single biggest threat to human health, according to the World Health Organization. Research has shown, that's better, research has shown that in 2019, over 9 million deaths could be linked with air pollution, and over 5 million deaths could be linked with suboptimal climate conditions. It's quite significant. We also know that the healthcare sector contributes to 5% of global emissions. That is the equivalent of the 5th biggest country, just behind India, China, Russia, and the States. So here's the good news. Solving the climate and health, solving climate and nature crisis is, quite frankly, the biggest opportunity for global health. If we get to net zero, and obviously nature positive, it will deliver automatic health benefits. It is an investment. We were talking about synergies, and Nina was touching on synergies. It's absolutely right. There's a cost association here, because we will essentially be saving in future health costs. I wanted to make a specific remark on nature, and again, Nina raised a very good point. The pharma sector does source quite frankly, agricultural, marine, forest-derived materials to make medicine and vaccines. So sourcing those responsibly is absolutely key, but actually we need to go further than that. Reducing the impact on nature, the impact on pressures really, is absolutely fundamental to health. We all know that forests provide food, livelihood, and they're obviously carbon sinks, but maybe what's not so clear is that healthy ecosystems also provide a key service to disease regulation. Because they take away potential pathogens. So the flip side of that is that degraded ecosystems do exactly the opposite, and they increase the likelihood of what we call pathogen spillage. So by that I mean the transmission of disease from animals to humans. Nature is absolutely key for our sector, as it provides the ingredients that we need to make vaccines. But one thing that sometimes it's taken for granted is the fact that clean water, in particular, is the single biggest health intervention, just followed by vaccines, really. So, okay, that's a bit of context. So, what are we doing in JSK? Just move this a little bit. Mitigation, absolutely critical. Our single biggest contributors to emissions is inhalers, and we are investing a lot on developing a green inhaler alternative. So that's the kind of one single biggest thing that we do. But on the spirit of collaboration, working with our suppliers and addressing our Scope 3 emissions, as Dominic raised, is absolutely key. In JSK, Scope 3 represents approximately 92% of our footprint, out of which 40% sits within our upstream, so our suppliers. So working with suppliers is really what will unlock pace and drive change in this space. And the approach that we have taken in JSK is to provide solutions. So in COP26, we launched the Energize program in partnership with now 15 other pharmaceuticals, which essentially provides access to power purchase agreements to our mutual value chains. We were pleased to announce just last week that the first cohort has been formed with over 300 companies in it, and again, small, medium, large. It's really the first of its kind in terms of collaboration in the pharmaceutical sector. We launched this week, or in this COP last week, the Activate program, which is really focused on our active pharmaceutical ingredient suppliers, which we know it's a significant chunk of our emissions footprint in Scope 3. And through that program, we will be providing suppliers with access to green funding and, frankly, practical support to implementation of decarbonization initiatives. And finally, last week, we also announced the work that we've been doing since COP26 with the Sustainable Markets Initiative, which is really about scale. Again, it's 7 pharmaceuticals, and we are focusing on addressing opportunities and issues in mutual value chains, in patient care pathways, and in clinical trials. So that's a little bit on mitigation. I just wanted, do I have a few minutes? Yeah? Just to talk a little bit about the work that we're doing with specific focus on people and nature. So last week we announced our partnership. We joined Race to Resilience, which the goal is to build resilience for over 4 billion people globally by 2030. We will be delivering partnerships. We will be delivering support through partnerships with organizations like Save the Children for that particular initiative. We are also focusing on building nature resilience through nature-based actions as part of programs like the Water Resilience Coalition, which supports people in water-stressed areas. And we have recently just joined the Alliance for Clean Air, which helps to reduce air pollution. The last program, which we are super excited to be proud of, it was an announcement that we made last year, is the LEAF Coalition. So we are one of the founding partners of the LEAF Coalition, and for those of you who don't know, it's the single biggest public-private coalition to protect tropical forests, with a pledge to invest $1.5 billion on forests and tropical forests in the future. So it's all about collaboration. It's all about partnerships. We need to do this together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renata. That was quite a kind of overview, not only of the challenges you face, but the kind of range of partnerships and collaborations that GSK is involved in. The one thing that really struck me quite at the beginning of your intervention was actually the kind of cost efficiencies that can be found when you're bringing together 2 or 3 strands, which wasn't something I'd thought about. I was thinking like it would add more complexity, but actually one could look at it in a different way and kind of, I guess, hit 3 birds with 1 stone in a way. That's probably not a very useful thing to say in a nature debate, is it? But you know what I mean. Which offers a very, very interesting business incentive in terms of rethinking strategy rather than different departments doing different things. So thank you for that. We might come back on some of the questions around, so what can politicians or the financial community do? But Cate, CDP, the world of disclosure. I mean, you have thousands of businesses coming to you and providing all their information on disclosure, one of the world's leading organization in that space. Been primarily climate, but you've led other areas in nature as well. So it'd be interesting to hear a little bit about that. And more importantly, are these worlds coming together in data and disclosure of nature and climate, and what's going on as far as you can see?
Thanks, Dominic, and yes, good afternoon, everybody. Everybody still awake out there? Do you need to stand up and have a shake around? If you do, please feel free to do that while I'm chatting. I'm used to it. I know how hard it is to get through. We're a few days to go before the end of the COP, right? It's been a long one. So yes, I'm Cate Lamb. I'm the Global Director of Water Security at CDP. I've worked there for 10 years now and have grown our water program from a very nascent initiative with about 150 companies disclosing, all the way through to this year to over 4,000 companies disclosing. CDP also offers a deforestation-related disclosure mechanism, which doesn't quite have the numbers, but it has the impact in terms of just about 1,000 companies disclosing forest-related impacts and the activities they're taking to avoid deforestation. And I am, because I'm not busy enough, also leading our expansion into oceans over the next 3 years. I similarly am wearing a hat of, you mentioned earlier, I am the co-chair of the SBTN Council, so Science-Based Targets for Nature. So I find myself sitting at this intersection between nature and climate. And I've been shouting for 10 years at CDP that, hey, you cannot have a climate smart company if it is undermining security, if it is deforesting. And whilst a number of people in the institution could get it, it was always deemed as a yes, but we need to do climate. We just need to get mitigation over the line and then we'll deal with nature. Well, I think I was the high-level climate champion water lead last year. I'm delighted to see what is arguably a breakthrough moment at Glasgow, in which the Glasgow Pact named explicitly in the text that the protection of nature systems is fundamental to driving climate action. That woke CDP up. We've got ex-CDPers in the room who will know how ingrained the climate narrative is within the institution and within a large number of our stakeholders up until this point. But they've woken up, which is fabulous, because there are so many risks, so huge amounts of opportunities, as we've already heard. So at the moment, from a very functional perspective, we still have separate, for corporates, climate, water and forest questionnaires, and we still have separate water and forest scores, and the 3 do not complement one another. And we understand as an institution that this has the real potential of driving unintended consequences, and that is not where we need to go into the future. And so we'll be spending the year ahead bringing the 3 together, both in terms of the questionnaires and in terms of the scores. So from next year, it's likely one of the scenarios we're exploring at the minute, and you're sort of privy to this. We've not gone public with it at the moment because we haven't made a decision. So don't start acting differently just yet, or preparing your submissions accordingly. But it's that you will not be able to get a score if you are not taking meaningful strategic action on water and forests. And so that is an efficient way of bringing these interventions together until we have an opportunity to really transform the disclosure mechanism itself. But one final area where we have brought these themes together is within our with our finance sector questionnaire. So companies such as GSK and SSE fill in our corporate questionnaires, but this year we've invited 1,200 publicly listed financial institutions for the very first time to disclose in one single questionnaire the efforts that they're taking to mitigate their financed impacts on water, climate and forests in the same place. And so we're learned the lessons from the past. We're seizing the opportunity with this very powerful set of institutional investors that control $120 trillion worth of assets to make sure that they understand and are taking that integrated action.
Okay, thank you. That's super interesting. I feel the pain of all of those internal meetings of when you're saying, no, we really do need to bring these things together and the world won't collapse. And in fact, there will be efficiencies and data collection and more punch to the outside world. So that's fabulously interesting. And I don't know if you noticed when you were saying about the trial that you're doing on this integrated data set, but certainly our friends on the corporate side are all busy writing it down. So I think you'll have some kind of questions and things afterwards and people come up to you, which I'm sure they should be happy to do so. But that bringing together of the data and bringing together disclosure is something I think we can probably sense is going to happen, over certainly our lifetimes, maybe 5 years, 6 years. So somewhere in the middle of all this is integrated data and interoperability of data and all sorts of things. Now, if we didn't think this was complicated enough, we've kind of done a climate, nature, health, integrated data and disclosure. Let's add another layer on this. Let's bring in McEwen, who's the Chief Sustainability Officer of Scottish and Southern Energy, now known as SSE. And Rachel, you're kind of at the front end of these transitions with your customers, but in fact, there's another, and some would say even more important dimension to this, which in the world of disclosure would be the S in the ESG, but it's perhaps better and more holistically known as the just transition. So perhaps you could illuminate a little bit more about that dimension for us. Thank you.
Switch the button on. Thanks very much, and thanks very much for having me today. So this notion of a just transition as we beaver our way to net zero, I like to think of it as being the intersection between E and S in our ESG world in the corporate sector. And SE was just happened to be the first company in the world to publish a just transition strategy, which we did 2 years ago now. And the reason why the word transition matters so much, it's sort of the clues in the title. We're a reasonably traditional electricity utility. We generate electricity, we transport it, we transmit it, distribute it, and we do sell some of it as well. And we are a sort of perfect example of that transition. So when I started doing this job 10 years ago, we directly emitted, our Scope 1 emissions were 25 million tonnes. This year it was 5 million tonnes. Now we can't stop there. We've obviously got all those things that Dominic mentioned. We've got science-based targets, we've got a net zero transition plan, we've got our TCFD report. But the criticisms of TCFD is that there are no humans in it. And actually, if we are to achieve net zero, we can't do it without the humans. So that's kind of the key point. So what we did as a company is that we set out, thought quite deeply, it's fair to say, how we impact on our humans. So as working people, the communities, but also our consumers. And we established a set of principles and really broke down and framed this into a transitioning out of high carbon activity simultaneously while transitioning in to new and low carbon activity. And when you really start to think of it, the opportunities for injustice actually become limitless. So you take positive action, first of all, to no harm, but secondly, actually there's a prize in a just transition. So if you look back at the industrial transformations of the past, they're not covered in glory in terms of their impact on working people and their communities. But also what's gone in the past is not utopia. So we have this opportunity. It's not just about dealing with the risks. It's an opportunity to make things different. We have more women, we have more diversity in my sector. We can change the way that we do things. Now, but I want to make a link to this core theme, which is about collaboration. So one of the reasons why SSE was the first company in the world to do this is because we had a very privileged vantage point, which is that we have been a member of the Scottish Government's Just Transition Commission for nearly 4 years, and we were part of the initial setup. And the Scottish Government wanted to understand from a government perspective across the whole of the economy what it could do that all the wonders associated with climate action, there's good things, that they are spread, everybody can access them, and the bad things associated with climate action, which are effectively costs, either lost livelihoods or costs on goods and services, that those things were not borne by a disproportionate set of people. So that was what we were set to do. And the commission consisted of industrialists like me, and then there was trade unionists, environmentalists, civil society, farmers, the National Farmers Union were involved. And if you had been at the very first evidence gathering session, and you'd been a fly on that wall, you would not have believed that consensus would be possible by the end. So it was high tension, and it felt like high stakes. But the truth is, we did get to complete unanimity. We got to complete consensus. And I asked a trade union colleague and the WWF colleague why they thought that was the case. And they gave two reasons. They said, first of all, net was unquestionable, like absolutely sacrosanct. That's what we're after. And the second was that every single one of us moved of some sort of compromise. We all did. We all shifted. So I suppose that the point is can you create radical collaboration? Yes, I think you do, but you need to create the frameworks and you need to put people in the same room to be able to thrash it out.
Gosh, there's quite a lot of wealth of experience from your journey there in both in the enterprise and in that Just Transition Commission. So we're going to go rapid fire, then I'll hand it back to Nina. I'm going to see if we've kind of managed to deliver our homework. But I had just kind of one ask, and I know it's always really difficult, but just one ask of a kind of one of the politicians or financial people, you know, someone who's got a big lever of power floating around out here. What would it be? Start with you, Cate.
For me, you won't be surprised to hear that it is make it mandatory. We want mandatory water, ocean, nature-related reporting for institutions and for companies around the world focused on impact and plans to reduce that impact.
That was brilliant. I think that would change an awful lot, wouldn't it? Rachel.
Just to say that we would welcome that. I think the point is the mandated stuff is perfect for dealing with risks, but where you have normative standards and voluntary is for all the wonderful opportunities to make the world even better. And I suppose my ask is for political leadership that helps create those frameworks and structures to force us to collaborate.
Okay, so echoing both, plus some, if I may. So on those frameworks, I think that putting health really at the center of mitigation and adaptation plans would be fundamental. That's for politicians. For the finance leaders, our ask is on valuation of nature, even if it's not perfect. Just put a price on it, because that will help so much with engagement with economists in general.
You couldn't ask for a better panel on this side of the table, Nina. With kind of levels of depth across all of these areas and with kind of crisp summings up. So thank you so much for this. And it would be remiss of me not to also mention that at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, despite a lot of meetings and noise, we implemented a connected set of membership criteria across climate, nature, and social-related issues and disclosure. And I can tell you how much that has lifted the bar in terms of people's understanding and kind of desire to move forward to the next level. So inspired by many of your areas of work and your membership. So thank you very much. And Nina, I hope we passed the test on this side, and over to you.
I feel like you're throwing down the gauntlet here rather than passing the test, to be honest. A little bit of element of healthy competition. So you actually have about 10 minutes for Q&A for your panel. So Salome is going to help us do that. So if you have questions, can you please raise your hands? There's a gentleman right in the very front, Salome.
Thank you very much to all of the panelists on the right-hand side here. Before we were focusing, my question is to Rachel. The scope of net zero is very vast. For any company, if you are representing the electricity utility, investing in interventions which are with a narrow view of a business that it should result in your rate of return, I think, you know. So what kind of challenges you face in investing on activities which are nature positive, are more sustainable in nature, and perhaps what kind of benefits were brought in through the collaboration, and perhaps who were the main your collaborators in achieving these inspiring, the objectives?
Well, we'll take, if there's one more, and then we can bundle them together. There's actually two more, if that's all right, and then you can capture one you want.
Hi, thanks. Scott Wilson from Canada. My question, sorry, is for Renata. You were mentioning the importance of health and linkages to nature, and you mentioned vaccines a little bit as well, and other raw materials that are important for health sector, for prescription drugs or whatnot. So I'm wondering what your experience has been. I come from the CBD world, not from the CCC world. So I'm wondering what tools, such as the Nagoya Protocol, and I know there's live discussions now on digital sequence information, how you view the various tools that the CBD and other international agreements have created to allow you to value nature in a more pragmatic way.
Okay.
Maybe we can find one more. There we go. Good question, by the way.
Hi everybody, and thank you. I'm Sebastian Thomas. I'm from the Queensland Investment Corporation in Australia. We are a government-owned financial institution managing about $100 billion of assets around the world. The question that I have is that while, to me, the logics, the business case is very clear for all of this, sometimes it's the case that speaking to traditional investors, to them it seems an issue of values rather than of financial return. And so my question is, when you are speaking purely to people, or to people who think primarily in terms of material risk and return, then it's the carrots, the incentives, the motivations, the business logics aren't clear, and I'm interested to get your take on that.
Brilliant. So that worked out rather well as a question each. We didn't plan that. But so in no particular order, Renata, there's one on kind of vaccines, health and digital innovations. I think Rachel there was sort of on collaboration, enterprise value, kind of engagement aspects. And Cate, you had one on the values of the materiality of the valuing, I suppose. Rachel, do you want to start, so go in order of when the questions were asked?
So I think your question is about what's the business case for nature positive, and how are we doing that, and also how are we collaborating. So we're actually publishing something today, and also you need to bear in mind that my comments are from our particular corner of the world, so it's very specific nature challenges that we face in our corner of the world. But what we're doing is we're not doing sort of TNFD at an enterprise level. We're trying to do it bottom up, and what we're committed to is from now, every development that we create onshore, so onshore wind farms and major transmission assets and substations, they will all be biodiversity net gain. Now, we've got some experience of this, and we're publishing today a methodology where we're basically putting it out into the public domain, because there isn't a way of counting this in Scotland with our particular challenges or particular flora and fauna. So I suppose the question about, first of all, how do we afford that? Is we made the commitment. Often our experience to date that it's actually allowed
imagination rather than a lack of finance to do these things. The truth is that the UK is one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. If you take a farmer's field and you build a substation on it, and you do your first calculation of what biodiversity was there, there's hardly anything, even on a farmer's field. It's not even in an urban environment. So if you take some steps which aren't particularly expensive, I'm sure there will be some that will be more expensive in the future, but at the moment they're not, because it's so bad. So the second you do interventions, you get massive biodiversity gains from it, 50, 60, 70% type and more by clever planting, clever design, and it's not really about the money. Now, in terms of collaboration, so to my point about the methodology, so some of this it's not been created before, it didn't exist. So we have to have, we need help, we need others to have a pop at it and tear it apart. So our way of doing that is basically, this is our best guess on how we can do this properly, and now we need collaborators to tick us off and tell us if we're not doing it right, and that's the approach we've taken. I don't know if that completely answers your question, though.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm sure there'll be some follow-up and all that. Renata,
Thank you for your question. Phenomenal question, by the way. I think there's two things here. One, just to say that we have a very clear understanding of our nature-derived materials in our value chain, and beyond the basics of sustainably sourced materials and all that framework and everything that entails, we also have very strong strategies around avoidance and reduction of those materials so that we can, in some cases, possibly completely eliminate pressures on nature that we have today. That's number one. But your question was specifically on Nagoya and the Nagoya Protocol. So on Nagoya, it's obviously something we take very, very seriously. We have a team dedicated to address that within JSK. We are monitoring progress very closely. We will be present at COP15 to really help understand current setup and identify next steps. So this is to say that it's very much in our radar. It is a priority, and we're taking action against it. Thank you.
And then over to you, Cate.
Absolutely. Again, great question. Thank you. At CDP and others, including Nina's amazing work at CISL, our efforts are to gather evidence and tell meaningful stories in ways that financial institutions can understand and resonate with. So we gather information at CDP around the corporate perception of risk associated with nature and in all of its forms. And 70% of the MSCI ACWI themselves perceive, in my case, water insecurity as a short-term risk that would generate a substantive change in their business in the next 1 to 3 years. So this is not not a long-term intervention that they themselves can afford to kick into the grass. Those companies articulate or report that they then are able to put a price on this. And in 2020, they reported that $336 billion of revenue is at risk, again, from water insecurity, and that it would cost them just $55 billion to solve for it, so 5 times less. It's much better to invest now than suffer the consequences. We've got evidence in the data set of stranded assets, major assets across oil and gas, mining, power generation, agriculture, multi-billion-dollar assets that are off the balance sheet, again, because the companies have made the flawed assumption that that water that they need would always be there. You only have to look at the Elon Musk battery factory in Germany a couple of months ago, where again, an asset that was stranded either temporarily or permanently. There's a large and growing number of instances of that happening, and we're forecasting them to continue. We collect data at CDP around value at risk, as well as the CapEx. So how much water-related CapEx every year are you investing to the risk or reduce your impacts? And for one sector alone, mining, CapEx investment has risen by 30% in the last 5 years. That is not an insubstantial redistribution of capital internally. And so it's gathering evidence that the finance sector can leverage and engage and understand in order to then articulate and shine a light on the fact that this is material, it isn't going away, and it will only get worse if the companies do not change their business as usual approaches.
Thank you, Cate, and thank you for those excellent questions. Nina, over to you.
Thank you very much. And now we're going to come to three absolutely fantastic women who've been sitting and waiting here super patiently. So let me introduce my panel on radical collaboration. So I've got with us Ilona, Szabó, member of UN Board of Effective Multilateralism. I have Yulia Dobrolyubova, partner at ERM, and Zoe Knight, group head of HSBC Center for Sustainable Finance. So let me start with a question to Ilona. Ilona, through your work with Igarape Institute, as well as reflecting on your experience with the UN, can you give us some real examples actually of how radical collaboration can be employed to bring the nature positive and climate agenda together?
Thank you so much. So it's a pleasure to be here and actually very, very tuned to what we're dealing with, both at the UN Secretary General Board on Effective Multilateralism. So let me just explain that first, but also at my work at the Igarape Institute, which is a global think and do tank based out of Brazil that works with public, digital, and climate security. So at the board, at the UN board, we are tasked on following up on the Secretary General initiative, which is our common agenda, that sets the framework for climate as the triple planetary crisis. So we need to avert that, which is climate disruption, biodiversity loss, and pollution. So very aligned, so we're totally on board that we need this radical collaboration. And there, we're thinking through a lens of a networked multilateralism. So it's not only proposals for member states, but also for private companies and investors, civil society, how all together we can avert. So we're hoping to set proposals that will be then negotiated and adopted at the Summit of the Future in 2024. So a lot to discuss with that side of the panel already on that. Wait for me, I'll follow up. But I wanted to bring a very concrete example on the work we're doing at the Igarape Institute within the framework of a collaboration, a multi-stakeholder collaboration to strengthen the rule of law, to diminish, hopefully to end deforestation at the Amazon basin and then enable sustainable development. So there we have three main pillars in the program that we're leading, which is first we need to understand the illicit economies that are destroying the forest. So we have a mapping the scope, scale, and dynamics of what we call an ecosystem of environmental crime. Then we work with governments to improve the governance of what we call command and control, which is from environmental oversight to law enforcement to the role of even public institutions such as the army in just safeguarding the forest. And this has a regional component as well. So Brazil hosts, my country, Brazil hosts most of the forest, but the forest, the basin is spread through 8 countries and one territory. And why is that important? Because the Amazon forest is a climate bomb. If it goes, no 1.5 degree. I mean, even if it's hard right now, like with the Amazon, we're really toast. So we cannot lose that. So for us, it's key. So at the Igarape, we have the third pillar of the work, which is then to involve the investors and private sector in traceability and actually using data, municipal level data, to add to the materiality matrix of the companies, to add really the real socio-economic metrics of each operation on the ground. So that's key for honestly doing a ESG, what we call the AAA ESG. We can't not have that when you're actually operating such vulnerable territories. And then to highlight what we're doing, of course, we are also in other major networks. For example, for the Amazon, we're part of the consultation for the Amazon, a network of over 500 individuals, companies, institutions that is also spinning off initiatives. And I just wanted to flag one here so we have time for discussion as well, because it's we're talking about finance, like both at the UN Secretary General Board. We know that we need for all this to happen in terms of reaching the goals we need, both for climate, for nature, for pollution. We will need a lot of money. But also on the ground, when we go to places like the Amazon, the cost of doing business there is quite high because of, honestly, the illegalities, this ecosystem that was installed. So we need blended instruments. We need, honestly, like a lot of listening to understand how we're going to be able to sustain new economic models on those territories. So we're finding out how to do that. And I just wanted to flag one, which is the Amazonian Sustainable Supply Chain Mechanism, which is out of the CPI labs, that leverages offtake agreements for forest-compatible products, providing upfront finance for cooperatives on the ground, but also technical assistance and structural community resources to catalyze the bioeconomy that is compatible with keeping the forest standing. So there is, there are companies that are including are here that are dealing already with that, like being the off-takers, and they're, blending the finance for this. So I have a lot of other examples and more information on this, but I just wanted to flag that what we need to do at the global level has to be very grounded on the realities on the floor. And so we're trying with the work at the Garapé Institute to both be there and understand the local needs, but also take that experience to inform global policy, for instance, at this effective multilateralism board. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Ilona. And now if we go from Brazil into more kind of Asia Pacific. So Yulia, can you give us some examples of successful public-private partnerships and the lessons that could be drawn from it there?
Thank you very much, Nina, and happy to share some examples from Asia, where I'm based and where I work. Well, generally, ERM is more known for working with private sector, with large companies and financial institutions who we help in climate and broader sustainability journeys. And in Asia in particular, more and more companies are taking net zero and biodiversity-related targets, understanding that these two topics of climate change and biodiversity are likely to be on top of their ESG material issues. But what comes with it is that these companies are more and more interested in investing in nature climate solutions. And the issue is that in most cases, NCS-related activities would not be part of the core business of these companies, which would require, of course, establishing either in-house team or partnering up with someone else to develop such projects. And another very common challenge is that oftentimes these kind of projects may not have enough potential within the country where this particular company is operating, or even within the value chain. So this is the value that ERM or other third-party consultants bring to this, and the partnerships we help create. Basically bringing together companies from one country, collaborating with companies from other countries, and also engaging local stakeholders, governmental institutions, local communities, and even local verifiers for nature climate solution projects. But this is more like private-private type of collaboration. But ERM also works on programs that would be driven by either governments or development finance institutions. And a very specific example of recent program that our team in Thailand was involved in was the development of low carbon and climate resilient cities across Thailand. And the program was led by United Nations Development Program, as well as the Thai governmental institution, TGO, that leads carbon market activities in the country. And a very interesting success factor for that project, which actually had a very, very explicit nature climate solution component, because we really looked into what kind of solutions cities can develop in the urban areas to address both climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, as well as biodiversity issues. And a very important success factor of this particular project was, first of all, to find proactive municipalities or cities within the country who would actually drive the process and who would own this process. And on the basis of these 4 cities that we have identified and who pioneered to be part of this initiative, we established what we call steering committees at the local level. And through these steering committees, we managed to engage local businesses, local communities, academic institutions, experts. And for the benefit of making our recommendations and developing pilot projects in the NCS space that would be relevant for the local context and would address specific needs of those stakeholders. And another important success factor that I think is also important for any kind of country or nature climate solution projects would be to bring in financial institutions. In developing countries like Thailand and other financial institutions still have very limited understanding of these kind of cross-cutting projects between climate and biodiversity. And they definitely need a lot of capacity building support to establish proper frameworks, to assess this kind of projects and to support this kind of projects. And through these initiatives that are led by the development finance institutions or development organizations and the governments, these financial institutions can receive additional support. And very last point from my side, collaboration and partnerships are also important within the core implementation team for these kind of projects, because the cross-cutting nature of nature-climate solution projects requires experts coming from GHG accounting, climate risks assessment, climate resilience fields, as well as financial side or modeling, or biodiversity, of course. And that requires also establishing very strong collaborative structure within the team that will be working on this kind of partnership initiatives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yulia. And we've been listening quite a bit into the importance of capacity building, but also into the importance of bringing finance into the conversation much more structurally. And I think one of the scariest things that I've probably read coming into COP27 was the Convergence report on blended finance, which said that actually if you look at blended finance flows, the ones that were done in 1922 are 60% down on the flows from 2016, 2018. Now this is not only going increasing, but this is going in a completely the wrong direction. So let me bring Zoe in here and ask her, Zoe, why isn't the financial sector moving faster, and what can we do to unlock this problem?
Thank you, Nina, and thank you for the invitation to participate this afternoon in a very rich discussion with my esteemed colleagues across the panel. I think it's often coming to the finance sector to fix everything. And I just really want to remind people how far we've come in terms of assessing climate factors and increasingly nature factors. But for sure, we need to do more and we need to move faster. So if we think about what we're trying to do with nature, we're trying to say, on the one hand, what are the risks embedded to an organization from not taking nature into account? And equally, we're trying to provide more capital to make sure that our ecosystem services and biodiversity richness remains intact. And so how do we go about that? How do we go about figuring out the risks and getting more capital moving faster? Well, Dominic, I think you really hit the nail on the head earlier when you said that it's really complicated. And it's complicated for several reasons in terms of finance. One, finance isn't really set up right now to incorporate public sector goods and economic externalities into account with financial decision making. Now, the good news is that is also the case with greenhouse gases, and we've managed to try and get a better system of greenhouse gas accountability. So we can therefore take experience from that and apply it to nature factors like water, plant life, oceans, and so on and so forth. But it is nevertheless a constraining factor to move at pace. And I want to really bring this to life by an example and really focusing on Brazil, actually. If you think about how our economic system works and how financial markets work, they're driven by signals from economic indicators like GDP, unemployment, inflation, interest rates, et cetera, et cetera. When you drill into an economy, those GDP numbers are delivered via goods and services and manufacturing capacity. But the power and the energy system that is being used to generate that economic output isn't taken into account. So the GDP number will be the same whether or not it's coal used to fire a power station or whether or not it's water. And we did a piece of work on Brazil specifically a few years ago to try and say, well, hang on a second, Brazil is a little bit of a nature superpower with both the forest and a power system generated by hydro and the rivers. What happens? Like, how do we factor in drought in the Amazonian river basin and that consequence on the economic productivity of the country as a whole? And needless to say, we really struggled to bring those numbers to life. But the World Bank is working on this, others are working on it, and what we expect to see in the future is a kind of factoring into national accounting systems that will help with that recording. So that's sort of one angle of how the economic architecture that we have today still isn't really fit for purpose for factoring in nature, but it will be able to do so through the likes of Cate's work on CDP and water. The second point on this is, even if you've got a framework that takes nature into account, what financial organizations need to do is operationalize an approach to embedding that into financial decision making. So what you need is a translation of this high level thinking into an action plan that can be funded. So if you're a country, for example, putting your adaptation plan into work, or your nature plan into work, that will set out a strong roadmap of what needs to be funded, so then you can look at the right areas of the capital stack that are going to be able to deliver that funding. Why is that important? It's because the access to capital is going to come from the private sector side, as we know from the blending, and the public sector side, but it's also going to come from philanthropic efforts as well. And so once you know what the funding requirement is, you can start to segment where the different sources of capital is going to come from. Okay, so what's going to help unblock this? Well, we're strong advocates of the work that's coming from the Task Force on Nature-Related Disclosure, the TFND. Because it builds from the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, and it means that it's the financial sector collaborating to identify metrics and mechanisms to better surface the risks embedded in not assessing nature. So what does the TFND mean to do? It's aiming to shift capital flows into nature to become nature positive. It's going to bring an understanding of the exposure in terms of financing, transmission channels, and give you the ability to integrate nature into sustainability strategies. HSBC is involved with this. The task force got 40 members. The framework will be released in 2023. We know that biodiversity needs are roughly around $800 billion, and they're only about 130 today, so we've got to scale up. And as part of our own net zero ambition, we're doing more on understanding nature-based risks by looking at the dependency of large corporates, the likes of GSK and others, to ecosystem services in order to assess how far the companies themselves are aware of the disruptive nature of nature shortage. I'm sure many people in the room will remember 2012 when there was a massive water deluge in Southeast Asia which affected supply chain in the electronics industry. That sort of consequence is 1 in a 100-year or 1 in a 25-year event, but nonetheless we can start factoring those extreme ranges of disruption into calculation. So risk assessment, opportunity set, what's important to deliver that? Well, mandatory reporting, as Cate points out, disclosure of the exposure, and then transparency on how companies are fixing it. So that gives a bit of an overview of what the finance sector is doing in terms of frameworks in order to drive this agenda a bit more comprehensively forward.
Thanks so much, though. And now we're back into the audience. More questions for the second panel. There's one right over there, Salome. And then, okay, so perfect. We have every sector represented. We're going to take one there, and then one there.
I'm Ruth Spencer from Antigua. And that task force you mentioned about with safeguards, and I see some gaps because that operates locally, but in the countries, you need the eyes of the local people. We have seen private sector companies come and do some horrible things. And if it wasn't for our advocacy, and our eyes are like the early warning system, we know our communities, and we know when they're doing something wrong. And not all the private sectors come to the multilateral agencies. There are some with sweet money that goes to our governments and corrupts them. And so it's very important that that process has local eyes on the ground to enforce regulations and to advocate when things are going wrong. Thank you.
Thank you. Salome, there was one in the middle, just here, the lady over there.
Yeah, hi, Vicky Copeman from ERM. Thank you very much. It's been a really fascinating panel. I love the title of this and the term radical collaboration. Both of those words are magic, and I feel that they're so unbelievably important in terms of us accelerating, moving and rapidly accelerating our way to in response to the climate and the nature crises that we're facing. My question is how well we, all of us in this room, as climate, nature leaders and others at this COP and beyond, are set up actually to be able to do radical collaboration. Do we know what it looks like? Do we know what it takes to achieve it, to maintain it? And what are the soft skills that actually we all need to have to be able to realize radical collaboration?
Thank you. And then to Harvey on the right. Salome, right there.
My congratulations on an excellent discussion. I wanted to zero in on what Zoe said at the end, which was the challenge of all of this is externalities, right? We haven't valued this stuff before, therefore free license to operate. And you pointed out quite rightly that we figured out how to deal with that with CO2. Part of what we figured out with CO2 is we could use a pretty easy thing, which was go to the fungible side of the property ledger, look at one molecule of carbon as, one from a factory in Stuttgart, Germany is the same as a tree planted in Indonesia. If it's exit out of the sky, you use private property principles of fungibility and exchange, and voila, here we are. The problem with intact nature, which is actually how you run the climate system, is it's always unique. It's more like real estate than it is like personal property. And we haven't figured out how to value that. And so I just wanted to get your insights on that, and also to share that in the Canadian Pavilion at the COP15, we'll be having a session on Business and Biodiversity Day to try to dig into this a little bit further. How do we deal with this problem of valuing or giving a business incentive, as the Australian gentleman asked? Like, why would you invest in intact nature beyond you're a good company or you're a good person? So any thoughts from Zoe or others on this? But I think this is a key issue for us to save the world.
Thank you so much, and I'm going to cheekily take the chair's privilege. So the way we've been doing it on nature-related financial risks is by using scenarios quite successfully, and by using scenarios then looking if we can actually derive financial materiality into financial portfolios from those scenarios, and then track that either into discounted cash flow valuations of particular companies or into internal or external credit ratings. But then now I'm going to zip it because the panel... Yeah. Well, that's why I've got a wonderful panel here.
Thanks, Nina, and I think it's really useful to bring in those sides. So, translating it it's essentially similar to translating the global carbon budget into how individual sectors will transition, right? But in terms of nature, I'm really struggling with this because, and the question that's coming at me a lot is, Zoe, what are we going to do about adaptation? Like, how are we going to finance adaptation? And we've got people who are working really hard on the nature biodiversity piece, but we haven't figured out how to link it to adaptation. And that would be useful because countries have got adaptation plans baked into the NDC, right? So if we can somehow get better at linking those two, it's a bit like having an investment roadmap for the mitigation part of the NDC. You kind of want a nature roadmap for the adaptation part of the NDC as an input into it. So thoughts welcome on how to get better at doing that.
And I wonder if that wonderful question on how do we bring in local communities, right, who have the understanding on the ground, who know what issues there are on both exactly adaptation and nature, whether that's one of the solutions there. So we have 2 more questions to look at. So one on radical collaboration and one on the local. I wonder, Ilona?
Sure, I'll just do the radical collaboration and 2 cents on the valuing nature, because then I think we're going to have to go out of the box, and I know that we need figures, but I don't think, I think we have to go beyond that as well. So for radical collaboration, I don't think we have a choice. Like all the issues that we're facing, they demand multi-stakeholder collaboration. So I think the urgency here is to make sure everyone understands what are the risks. And I think because of this information and everything that we're living through, like a divisive set of societies, we're having trouble in really mobilizing. And also how to mobilize without scare, because you don't want people just to freak out, you want people to act, right? But just to say, I don't think there's any other way. And for soft skills, first of all, listen, because we think we know everything. When you go to a table with all sets of stakeholders, you have to listen to people. And I think that's the one, if I could pin one thing that is missing in all this noise, is that we need to understand different points of view to then try to build the consensus, like the first, second, and third step. But I just feel that there's no way out. If we don't sit down, that won't happen. And in terms of valuing nature, there's a very, a ethereal question. I know this is very objective what you're saying, but when we talk then to indigenous communities, traditional communities on the ground, there's so much knowledge. And how do we tap into this ancestors' knowledge, into traditional knowledge? Because we are missing big time, like let's say, the value of things. And then Mark Carney tries to put that in his book, but I see this so much on the ground. So I think we have to do a little blue sky thinking, not only financiers and private sector people, but we need to get out of our boxes if you want to tackle this in a way that we touch people, and that we actually come with the frameworks that then will be applied to business and to finance sector that will make sense of what we're going through. But I know this is very far, but I'm just convinced that we need to integrate them into the picture as well.
Thank you very much. Just to confirm that, yes, radical collaboration is very important. And I think the key here would be having the right networks, because again, we talk about very multidisciplinary topic, and again, you need to have proper connections on the ground so that the recommendations, the projects are very deeply rooted into what the local communities in fact need in terms of climate change mitigation, adaptation, as well as biodiversity conservation and enhancement. So with that said, soft skills, yes, ability to bring all stakeholders together and yes, indeed hear their needs and transform these needs into practical solutions. I think that combination of strategic vision and technical skills will be really important for this kind of projects.
Building on that point about strategic vision and technical skills, and the answer is no, I don't think we are particularly well set up for radical collaboration, but I think that there are individuals that are determined enough to make it happen that pull others along, and I think GFANS is a really great example of that. There is no incentive whatsoever for banks or financial institutions to get in a room together to solve problems around how they should all adopt a climate transition plan and what sort of framework that should look like. Nonetheless, April 2021, we were all sitting in a room talking about how we were going to form a net zero banking alliance to be the entry point to be part of GFANS. And the incentive structure was, this is a really tough problem. The whole world wants us to finance the solution at the same time as telling the world what our climate transition plan is for not financing fossil fuels anymore. And so to do that, to come up with an answer for that, you have to be able to talk about it in an open and trusted space, and you have to be able to compare with peers. So it takes a couple of people that are really strong leaders in their organization to empower the organization to say, yes, we are going to work on this like this. We are going to retain our own business strategy of how we see our vision of the future, but equally, we can see that this problem is so difficult to solve that we've just got to start talking about it in a more comprehensive way. And I think for nature, we'll start to see more of that coming through within certain types of sectors that are particularly dependent on nature-based resources like food and agriculture, like the pharmaceuticals for water, some of the consumer goods companies, and that will start to bubble up.
Nina, do you mind if I just come in on the lady's point from Antigua about reputation?
Sure, but
Just
super quick because
super,
we're almost
quick.
out of time.
Please, more. At CDP, we track the perception of companies with regards to their reputational risk, right? And reputational risk is where they've been found to be doing harm. That story has hit the media. The company panics and acts. Over the last 5 years, the corporate perception of reputational risk from water security has plummeted. There's not enough loud civil society and local community stories emerging into the mainstream media to pull that vital lever, and we are all the poorer for it. It's fabulous to hear that the Global Commons Alliance Accountability Accelerator is emerging as a vehicle to provide finance for local communities, for local civil society, to bring these stories to life so that NGOs such as myself can grab hold of them and show them to the companies or the finance institutions and say, your brand is really at risk. You will lose a social license to operate in that location if you continue to do so. So it is a hugely powerful tool. Please keep it up. If we can help with financing in any way, let me know. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Cate. And I guess what remains is for Dominic and I to wrap up. What did I take from our conversation? The cost of inaction is huge, and Ilona was talking about the Amazon forest. Renata was talking about health costs, and I remember a number in the green finance strategy in the UK of £4 billion a year of health costs if we don't stick to our emission reduction targets by 2030. A lot of conversation around capacity building with local communities, as Hyacinthe was saying, with local financial institutions, but also, quite frankly, among the corporates and large multilateral financial institutions as well. Compromising, I really like that point about compromise, but also staying true to our goals of 1.5 degrees and nature positive. So I think that's my takeaway. Dominic?
Well, it's been quite a good discussion, isn't it? It's been pretty interesting in these two areas. So thank you very much over here. I'm glad, Cate, that you mentioned the Accountability Accelerator. So do check it out. Maybe Cate will know about it, I'll know about it, but it's geared towards organizations like yourself to hold local corporates to account. So check that one out. I think, Harvey, this is where it does get quite interesting. You've seen in the climate space, above and beyond the inventory accounting, which is kind of like sort of risk compliance management, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, the demand pull thing coming through to accelerate technologies, but also to accelerate existing contributions into society. This avoided emissions bit, which is outside of the scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, but to pull more into the marketplace. And I think your real estate comparison is a really well-made one for the kind of key biodiverse areas of the world. What are those hotspots, and how, above and beyond the kind of risk mitigation element of the TNFD, if you pass that stage gate as a leading company, you are able to go to stage 2, which is to put excess revenue into some of those landscapes and win in whatever way we want to determine that mechanism, and be a leading company and therefore get access to cheaper cost of capital. And as a way of doing that, which is a little bit beyond just the kind of compliance piece of the TNFD and where it's coming from. Happy to talk more about that. But I think that would be the breakthrough there. And that's what's going on in the climate piece at the moment. I do think that for any of us, we mentioned about the elements you're putting in place in CDP, we're putting in place in WBCSD, the high-level expert group recommendations on what non-state actors should aspire to is a very important one, including for the financial community and all that is in the asset base. So it was great. I think now, here's the thing. Would the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership be game to do this next year? And have similar, if not the same kind of panel, similar kind of audience, to see if we've actually managed to find some examples of this and make progress, rather than just come at it as a one-time.
Absolutely, you're on.
Brilliant. There we go. Job done. Okay, thank you very much. You've been lovely. Have a lovely rest of the evening. Thank you, Nina, and thank your brilliant staff for all that you've done and all that you do. And thank you, panelists, and have a lovely afternoon. Thank you, audience.
Thank you very much.